Hello, welcome to the second episode of this podcast in the name of Jesus. Today, I have a topic that I feel is the one that may cause the most shock to someone that's going through an awakening of some sort, a consciousness awakening of some sort, or someone that's in the search of truth, the truth of life. And this is to entertain the fact that God may be a person, or to encounter people that believe God is a person, that God is not just an abstract force in the background of the universe, or that God is not just the universe itself. That personally, I feel was the biggest shock that I had when I started having my own encounter with Jesus Christ. So now I want to share some revelations or even just reflections about this idea that God is a person. And I start by making a parenthesis that this is not a judgment to those who refer to God as the universe, or those that say things such as I'm asking the universe or I'm thanking the universe for something. Know that this is not a judgment to that kind of thinking at all. I actually understand quite well in my own personal journey. I also found myself in a time of my life where I also referred to that higher force as a universe that I still didn't quite know how to call it yet. And I think that comes from a genuine desire of stopping this perception of separation between us and God. At least that's where it came from for me. I started calling it the universe because when I was a child, I was educated to think that God was separated from me in some other place that was holier than this earth made up of matter. So that caused this perception in my psyche that we are separated from God, that God is this distant God that's not really close. So when I started growing up and at a more adult stage of my life, when I was in the search of truth, in the search of life, I started calling God the universe in this attempt to establish the truth that the divine is not separate from our physical body, from our matter. And I think that's actually very accurate. So I feel like back then I wanted to establish this in some sort of affirmation that if God is indeed everything, then I'm a part of everything, and the universe itself is everything. Therefore, why would I perceive God as separate from us if we ourselves are part of everything? Right? And we ourselves are part of the universe. So I understand referring to God as a universe. I feel that it comes from this intention of wanting to dissolve the separation between God and us. And remember that the truth is that God is not only very present right here, right now, but that God is also intimately and intrinsically combined with the very fiber that composes us, just as the universe itself, just as the universe is this set of molecules coming together, and our body is part of that set of molecules. I feel like that's where this need of calling God the universe comes from. Because it's true, there has indeed been a need to affirm that God is everything. Therefore, if God is everything, then God is everywhere and God is in every single molecule in the entirety of the universe. So that's why I wanted to start this episode in this way, to recognize the fact that there is a place for that reflection. However, today we're going to go even deeper. And I feel that as God starts calling us to have a more personal encounter with Him, we're going to get to know way more things that we used to think were impossible. Because to speak of a personal encounter with God, personal person, is already to recognize an element of person in God. In the last episode, we spoke about how it is not possible to trust in life if we don't know life, that it is not possible to trust in God if we don't truly know God in an intimate encounter. and therefore realize in this way that he is indeed trustworthy, and how that's where trust starts to blossom organically. Not because I'm trying to force myself to trust, because that's actually something that cannot happen. Trust cannot be forced, trust cannot be faked. So, in the last episode, we developed this topic and we recognized that to be able to trust God, we have to know God, and not just know God mentally, but have that personal encounter with Him. And again, the emphasis in how speaking of a personal encounter already speaks of the concept of person in God. And later in this episode, we will elaborate in that topic. However, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I want to go back to the topic that I was talking about, uh, which is seeing God as the universe, or simply calling Him the universe, or saying things such as asking things from the universe. Again, even though I do see the value in that reflection, the fact is that that vision of God is limited. And if we follow that line of thought and go deeper into it and actually commit ourselves to live this relationship with the universe itself in our day to day, eventually we will find ourselves with the realization that we don't believe God is simply the universe, but that we actually believe that there's this, at least this force, this abstract force that gives order to things, that this abstract force is love for many of us, and that's what we see as God, love, which is accurate. Again, that's just a little piece of truth. That's still a vision that can be limited in regards to everything that God wants to reveal to us in His own definition and revelation of love of God. Because as we start to define God, we start to define love as well. Now, let's entertain this idea a little, the idea of God being an abstract force in the background of the universe, and this abstract force being one with the entire universe. I think that right here we start refining our perception of God, because it goes from going simply the universe to this abstract force in the background of the universe and intertwined with the universe, but that's superior to us, that's higher. And some people may even call this kind of abstract force universal consciousness or universal intelligence. And I think this gets a little closer, or a step closer to God. Instead of simply calling God the universe, it's refining God a little more, because this perception recognizes, okay, it's true, it's not just the universe, there's something more behind, there's an intention. There's an intention behind creation itself. And to speak about intention is to speak about will, is to speak about the will that wanted creation to exist in the first place. The intention and the will that wanted this universe to exist. And to speak about will, and this is starting to get even deeper, these are deeper concepts. To speak about will is to speak about freedom, free will. Freedom itself is the ability to do things that you will, that are in your will. If you're doing things that are not in your will, then you're being a slave to someone else's will, right? You're doing things against your will. So freedom implies will. But now I'm getting a little ahead of myself again to next episodes. So let's go back a few steps again to entertaining now the topic of this universal consciousness. This is something that's very spoken of in the community of alternative spirituality of all sorts of different doctrines of spirituality. This idea that everything is consciousness, which is also a concept that's backed up by quantum physics. But where I feel that both quantum physics and these different doctrines of alternative spirituality kind of fall short is in the distinction between something being consciousness and something having consciousness. It's not the same thing to be consciousness than to have consciousness. Or, in other words, it's not the same thing to be consciousness and to be conscious. This relates again to the topic of having will, of having free will that not only perceives something, but that it can also do something with that which he or she is perceiving. So, that moment to have consciousness, to be conscious, is like this moment in which you go, oh, I'm conscious. Now I have my own will. Now I have my own free will. And I can do something with this consciousness that I have. And to understand this, it is useful to study authors or philosophers that speak about the risks of artificial intelligence. For example, why it is not the same to have a computer program that's simply following a programming or a code, that's simply acting in response to this program like a robot, but that program or that robot doesn't have a free will of their own, right? Because it's simply a programming. That's the difference with maybe artificial intelligence, that in these fiction, science fiction novels, take this step of having consciousness of their own, of being conscious now. Again, this is the difference between simply being consciousness itself and having consciousness of your own, or now being conscious yourself. The moment that you are conscious yourself, you also have your own free will. You also have your own will. So, in this example of technology, the moment that it has its own consciousness, now it is not only a program responding unconsciously, that the word itself says it unconsciously, without consciousness, without having consciousness, simply repeating a program, a computer program. And now it goes on to have its own consciousness. And by having its own consciousness, it also has its own free will and its own will. So it's not the same to be consciousness than to have consciousness. Another example of this distinction or difference between being consciousness and having consciousness, even though all of the universe is consciousness, which means that within the particles of existence, even before being particles, there is this element of consciousness that so studies quantum physics, for example, that doesn't even know what consciousness is in itself, that so intrigues science, is taking a look at creation and knowing that even though everything is consciousness, for example, a tree is made up of consciousness, however, a tree doesn't have consciousness. A dog is consciousness, but a dog doesn't have consciousness. A chair is consciousness, but it doesn't have consciousness. In creation, the only creature created in the image and likeness of God, with that ability to have consciousness and therefore to have free will, the freedom that comes hand in hand with having consciousness, is us, human beings. In nature, for example, dogs, animals, they don't have their own consciousness, they don't have their own free will. Their behavior, their actions are a response to their own animal impulses, instinct. The same thing happens with a tree. It doesn't have its own free will, it doesn't have its own willpower to decide to all of a sudden move to another place. It doesn't have consciousness. It is consciousness, but it doesn't have consciousness. And this relates to the fact of how it is only in front of another human being that we feel shame. Had you ever noticed that? We only feel self conscious in front of another human being. Only in front of another human is where we have this phenomenon of asking ourselves, what would this person think of me if I say this or if I do this in front of them? But if I say something or do something that might be considered improper in society, if I do that only in front of a dog, we don't really feel the same shame. We don't feel self conscious if we do that in front of a dog or in front of a tree, right? In front of a dog, we could do all sorts of things. We could scratch our butt. maybe take out a booger out of our nose, and we wouldn't feel judged by the dog. We wouldn't feel judged by a tree if we do all sort of ridiculous things. We wouldn't feel shame in front of a tree or in front of a dog. Why? Because we know that both the tree or the dog don't have their own consciousness. Therefore, they don't have their own thoughts that they could use to judge me, right? Like another human being. If I scratch my butt or take a booger out of my nose in front of another human being, who knows what they will think about me, right? Who knows if they will judge me, because that person does indeed have their own consciousness and their own free will. Now, let's take this conversation a little further. Let's say you did scratch your butt in front of your dog, and all of a sudden your dog starts talking to you. That would for sure freak you out. That would for sure scare you, because your dog would all of a sudden look more like a cartoon than like a real dog, right? He would look more like a cartoon character or a character taken out of a movie where dogs speak more than a real dog. And when I thought of this, I was thinking of my dog, Laika. I was thinking, it's true, if Laika all of a sudden could speak and told me, hey, I see you scratching your butt. And then I see that Laika has a consciousness of her own and she would look more like a cartoon character. That took me to reflect in how the Spanish word for cartoon, this is dibujo animado, animated drawing. It took me to reflect on the word animated, because in its roots, in its etymology, it comes back to the word anima. And in ancient philosophy, the anima of something is like their soul, like their spirit. So that in turn took me to reflect on how an animated drawing or a cartoon that's animated, it's not that the cartoon has a consciousness of its own, it's that this cartoon was animated, was given its anima, quote unquote, right? Because it's not a real anima. Because if it had its own real anima, it would have its own consciousness. Therefore, it would be like artificial intelligence, with the risk of the cartoon having a free will of its own and rebelling against its own cartoonist, or the person that's programming the cartoon, animating the cartoon. So, of course, it's not like the cartoon has its own anima, but it took me to reflect on how that cartoon had its anima, was given life, quote unquote, by the programmer, by the cartoonist that brought that drawing to life. It is a programmer that's animating that drawing for it to look like it's moving, it's speaking. It's a whole team, right? Because it's the computer programmer, it's also the artist of the drawings behind, it's also the voice artist that's lending his or her voice to the cartoon. So it is all these people that actually have consciousnesses of their own, the ones that are giving life to the cartoon. And that took me to reflect, how about us? Who is giving us anima? Who is giving us life? And the obvious answer is God, right? Of course, this is an even deeper mystery because a cartoon doesn't have a free will of its own, but we do. So God is giving us the anima, and He's also giving us the free will, the ability to have consciousness, to decide what to do with that anima, with that life. But the fact that we recognize that we ourselves are given anima, life, that must have been given by someone else that also has anima. Not only by something else, but by someone else that also has consciousness. So now we're starting to get into this topic of how God is also a person. Because only someone that has anima of his or her own, that has a consciousness of his own, can also give anima to someone else, can also give consciousness to someone else. So it's not just something, it's a someone. So now that we've taken this journey in navigating the difference between being consciousness and having consciousness, we get to the conclusion or the revelation that only God has consciousness, first and foremost, because He's a great I am. He's the one who perceives through the consciousness that he has, and also has the freedom and the ability to create from that freedom, that will, that initial intention. So I would even dare to say that that consciousness that everything is, that quantum physics speaks about, that consciousness that is the trees, that consciousness that is the dogs, that is intertwined with everything, that is the consciousness that God has. Again, the difference between being consciousness and having consciousness. The consciousness that everything is had by God. God is the owner of that consciousness. God is the owner of that consciousness, and He decided to share that consciousness with us because we were created in His image and likeness. There is no other creature that will cause you to feel shame or self conscious because it has a consciousness of its own. It's only humans, or that could judge you a certain way according to your behavior. There's no other creature that will make you feel something like that other than another human being. And now we're going into my favorite topic in this second episode, my favorite codes in relation to how God is a person. And for this, we can look at the word person itself. What does it mean? What does it truly mean to state that something or someone is a person? So I went back to the etymology of the word person, and I saw that it comes from the Greek pros, opos. Pros means in front of or before. Opos means face. And what this seeks to transmit, or the message that seeks to be conveyed by this word in ancient Greece, when this word is being birthed, pros opos, is this concept of like a mask, right? What is that we wear in front of our face? Pros in front of, opos face. It's like a mask, right? A mask that we wear in front of our face. That's the construction of the ego, the construction of the persona. So the ego is this mask, this construction of the persona of our identity that we wear in front of our face. In other words, it is this identity that we carry. And when I saw the etymology of this word, I started to feel a certain rejection to the concept of person itself because of the idea of the person being this mask that we wear in front of our face, because of the bad rep that the ego has had, right? How the ego has been this false identity to fit in society, to make sure that you're not rejected by others, to live in survival, etc. So I started to feel this rejection to this concept of a person, but something that God revealed to me was the fact that a mask can indeed be used to hide truth with a false identity that you wear in front of the face, or it can also be used to express truth. And when I feel this revelation, I was like, whoa, okay, there's something deeper here. And I waited a little longer to see what else there was to be revealed. And as I navigated these concepts, I I became aware that the mask that is used to hide truth would be the false identity of the ego, right? To hide the essence unconsciously, because we know that all of this happens unconsciously. And the mask that expresses truth, or that was designed to express truth, is the very human face of flesh and bone that was given to us by God, our face. This mask of flesh, this mask of skin that God gave us, if it didn't exist, if I didn't have these lips or these muscles in my face that allow me to smile, or my eyebrows that allow me to express anger, or the simple fact that I can be touched very deeply and moved to my core, and I can cry out of this emotion, and I can express this feeling. If I didn't have this face perfectly designed by God to express these deep feelings, other people wouldn't even know whether I'm smiling or I'm angry or I'm sad. Can you imagine the face of your mom or your best friend or your brother without that mask of flesh, of skin that allows that beautiful expression? Can you imagine just seeing bones or even another layer, just seeing the muscles, that red flesh that's under the skin? Even if we saw that red meat on top of the bones, you wouldn't be able to know if they're feeling sadness or joy or love. That expression is allowed by the mask of skin that God has put upon our faces. It is a mask that allows the expression of truth. And that knowledge again took me to explore the idea of cartoon and why is it that when we want to make an inanimate object inanimate without anima, without life, an inanimate object, why is it that when we take an inanimate object and we want to make a cartoon out of it? For example, we have Annoying Orange, right? This character that in real life, an orange is an inanimate object, but all of a sudden, we place it in an editing tool on the computer, a program, and we put eyes and mouth to that orange, and we put this face on the orange, and all of a sudden, it's an animated orange. Why is it that when we want to animate, bring life to an inanimate object, we put a face on? And we could also animate something simply giving it voice. I think that's another form of animating something, the expression through the voice, the tonality of the voice. However, to have a more complete expression, we put a face on that object. And cartoons are filled with examples of this. For example, the map in Dora the Explorer, it has eyes, it has mouth. Annoying Orange also has eyes and it has mouth. And I think that it has to do with God's perfect design in our face to express emotion, to express anger, joy, sadness, love. And with these revelations, I can't help but imagine God being love, right? God is love. I think this is something in which we all agree in that God is love, unless you're an atheist and you don't believe in love. Because if you're an atheist and you do believe in love, let me tell you, like in the last episode, you believe in God. You just don't know it yet because God is love. So I imagine God being love before time even existed, before the fiber of time space, the continuum of time space existed, being love and therefore loving, 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 and exploding in love. And coming to this point where he's like, I can't take it anymore. I need to create someone in my own image and likeness to be able to express all this love that I am, to be able to express through us. And of course, also to have more recipients of his love, more objects of his love, more loved ones, more beloved of his. God, in his loving nature, since God is love, the first thing God does is to love, simply needing that recipient to receive his love. And that, of course, is all of creation, but more specifically, human beings created in his image and likeness, which in more religious language, maybe it would be the fact that we are God's tabernacle. But in more common language, it is simply stating that we are where God lives, where God inhabits. We are God's house. We are his recipients. So, knowing all of this, let's do a quick recap of the concepts that we spoke of in this episode. Knowing that God's will is active because God wanted to express himself, because there was an initial intention behind creation, behind the very existence of the universe, and knowing the fact that God has a will of his own is also a sign that God has consciousness, which in fact, God would be the only one that truly has a consciousness of his own, but he shares it with us. That ability to have our own consciousness is given to us by God. It makes sense to state that God is also a person, that God is also pros opos, in front of the face, before the face, to be able to express that consciousness that he has. And a few months ago, I would have simplified my conclusion of this episode by saying that Jesus is that expression, which of course he is. Jesus is that pros opos in front of the face of God, as the Bible says that the Word was always with God and face to face with God, the incarnate Word, which is Jesus himself. And also the fact that the Bible says that Jesus is who reveals the Father, just as a face reveals the expression pros opos in front of the face of someone that's wanting to express truth. However, now I feel the need to say that this is an even deeper mystery. Obviously, Jesus is God's expression, but it is not only one person, it is three persons in one single God. And that's the mystery of the Trinity. But I think that for now, it is enough to start seeing God's qualities in how God has a consciousness, God has a will of his own, and therefore has freedom. God is freedom because God is love, and that God is also a person. And this is what allows us to have a all personal encounter with God. And that's where we go from knowing God to meeting God. It's an encounter, it's a meeting. It's a face to face, pros opos, personal encounter. This is where we start to explore how it is very possible, it is indeed what we were created for, to have this encounter with our own creator. If you got to this point in the episode, thank you so much for listening to it completely. I would love to read your comments, your feedback, and even any questions or invitation to more reflection, because these are definitely concepts that invite us to navigate more. These are not just static statements. On the contrary, I feel that when we start meeting God, we start to live in a reality that's way more dynamic the more that he reveals himself. So leave me your comments and I'll see you next time.